In the dead of a Roman night, a cold silence hangs over St. Peter's Square. But within the bronze doors, a different kind of silence reigns. It is the silence of a secret, hastily kept. Why was the body of Pope John Paul I, the smiling Pope, embalmed just hours after his death before any official autopsy could be performed? What document, later found in the Vatican archives, details the direct transfer of funds from the Holy See to a shell company run by the Sicilian mafia? This is not a story about faith. It is a story about power. An empire built not on prayers but on secrets. An institution that has mastered the art of survival through methods that would make emperors and crime bosses blush. We think we know the Vatican, the gilded domes, the clouds of incense, the figure in white blessing the masses. But behind the marble and the piety lies another story. A history written in blood, secured by forgery, and paid for in gold and souls. It begins in the ruins of one empire with a bold and brilliant lie that would give birth to another. The Roman Empire was bleeding out, a magnificent beast dying in the streets. Into this vacuum of power stepped a new faith, a radical Jewish sect that had somehow survived its own persecution. How did a religion of the poor and the outcast, whose founder was executed as a criminal, inherit the throne of the Caesars? The answer is not a miracle. It is a masterpiece of political engineering and audacious fraud. The cornerstone of this new empire was a single piece of parchment known as the Donation of Constantine. This document, supposedly written by the Emperor Constantine the Great himself in the 4th century, granted the Pope of Rome supreme authority over all of Europe, effectively making him the emperor's spiritual and temporal heir. For centuries, this document was the Vatican's legal basis for crowning kings, seizing lands and waging wars. There was only one problem. It was a complete and utter forgery, a brilliant piece of propaganda likely concocted in a papal office some 400 years after Constantine was dead. The lie was so grand, so effective, that by the time it was definitively proven false during the Renaissance, the power it had created was too entrenched to be challenged. The inquisitors burned men for questioning a single word of the gospel, but the entire foundation of their temporal power was built on a counterfeit signature. It was the original sin of the papacy, the discovery that if you tell a lie big enough and defend it with enough holy fire, it becomes the truth. This war for control was not just fought with ink and parchment, it was fought by erasing history itself. Before there was a single, unified church, there were many Christianities. The Gnostics, for instance, believed salvation came not through blind faith in a distant institution, but through gnosis, direct, personal knowledge of the divine. They wrote their own gospels, texts that portrayed a Jesus who was a mystical teacher, not a sacrificial lamb. They spoke of a God who was both masculine and feminine. For the burgeoning power in Rome, this was not just heresy, it was competition. These alternative scriptures had to be destroyed. Agents of the Roman bishops hunted down and burned these texts, erasing entire schools of thought from history. The Gospels of Thomas, of Mary Magdalene, of Philip, all condemned to the flames. It was the first great book burning, a campaign to ensure that only one version of the story would ever be told, their version. What knowledge was lost in those fires? What visions of the divine were stamped out to create a more manageable, more controllable faith? The first secret the Vatican hides is the memory of the brothers and sisters in Christ it had to eliminate to claim its monopoly on God. The methods of elimination were not always metaphorical. As the Church's wealth and influence grew, the throne of St. Peter became the most desirable prize in Rome. The elections of popes descended into vicious street brawls financed by rival aristocratic families. Bishops who stood in the way of a powerful candidate had a habit of succumbing to sudden, violent illnesses. Poison became a tool of ecclesiastical policy. Ambitious deacons hired thugs to ambush and mutilate their rivals. In the year 897, the depravity reached a new, almost surreal level. Pope Stephen VI, seeking to delegitimize his predecessor, Pope Formosus, had the man's 9-month-old corpse exhumed from its grave. The rotting body was dressed in full papal vestments, propped up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran and put on trial for heresy. A young deacon was appointed to speak for the corpse, trembling as he answered the accusations leveled by the living pope against the dead one. This macabre spectacle, known as the Cadaver Synod, was not an act of madness. It was a calculated political move, a gruesome piece of theatre designed to erase a rival's legacy. It demonstrated a core principle that would guide the Vatican for centuries. There is no line that cannot be crossed, no act too grotesque in the pursuit of absolute power. The early centuries of the papacy were a masterclass in converting spiritual authority into hard political reality. Every prayer was a potential tax, every confession a source of intelligence. The men who ruled the church in these formative years were not mystics. They were pragmatists, politicians, and sometimes killers. They understood that empires are not built on hope. They are built on fear, on control, and on the strategic application of force. They took a message of peace and turned it into a declaration of war against all who would not submit. The destruction of the Gnostic library was a warning. There is only one truth, and we own the copyright. The assassination of a rival bishop was a memo. The career ladder here is steep, and the falls are fatal. They were creating more than a religion. They were building the most resilient and enduring corporation the world has ever known, a multinational enterprise with a unique product, salvation. And business was booming. The great cathedrals of Europe were not just houses of worship, they were corporate headquarters built on the profits of a carefully managed monopoly. This brutal consolidation of power set the stage for 1,000 years of dominance. The methods were refined, the scale of operations expanded, but the fundamental strategy remained the same. First, establish an unchallengeable narrative and destroy all alternatives. Second, legitimize this narrative with sacred documents, real or forged. Third, defend the narrative with absolute force, branding dissent as heresy and punishing it with death. Fourth, convert this spiritual authority into tangible wealth and political influence. This was the blueprint, the brutal genius of the early papacy. They were not just the heirs of St. Peter, the fisherman, they were the true heirs of the Roman Caesars, cloaking imperial ambition in the humble robes of a Galilean preacher. They understood that the greatest power on earth is not the power to command armies, but the power to command what people believe to be true. The early sins were not a deviation from the path, they were the paving stones of the path itself. Every forged document, every burned book, every murdered rival was a necessary investment in the creation of an eternal empire. An empire that would soon descend into a darkness of its own making, a moral abyss from which it would emerge even stronger. The violence and forgery that forged the papacy's worldly power were merely a prelude. The empire was established, its legal and spiritual claims staked out with a combination of clever lies and cold steel. But what happens when the guardians of morality lose their own? What occurs when the institution that claims to hold the keys to heaven turns its own headquarters into a living hell? The period that followed the early power grabs is known to historians as the Saculum Obscurum, some the Dark Age. It is a time the modern church would prefer to forget, a century of such profound corruption that it makes the most decadent Roman emperors look like choir boys. The throne of St. Peter, once a prize for ruthless politicians, became the plaything of a single, powerful Roman family and the line of ambitious, beautiful, and utterly merciless women who ran it. It was an era when the holiest office in Christendom was decided not in a conclave of cardinals, but in the bedroom of a senator's wife. The papacy became a hereditary heirloom passed down from mothers to their lovers and from fathers to their illegitimate sons. This was the age of the pornocracy, a term coined by a later cardinal, a time when Rome was ruled by the Theophylacti family. The true power was Theodora and her daughter Marozia, two aristocratic women who controlled the city through a network of alliances, assassinations, and sexual liaisons. They were the ultimate kingmakers, or rather, pope-makers. Popes were their lovers, their sons, their grandsons. Pope Sergius III, a man who had his two predecessors murdered, took Marozia as his mistress when she was just a teenager. Their illegitimate son would later become Pope John XI. Think about that for a moment. The Vicar of Christ, the successor to St. Peter, was the bastard son of another pope. Marozia herself was a force of nature. She had Pope John X, a former lover who had outlived his usefulness, imprisoned and suffocated with a pillow in the Castel Sant'Angelo. She then installed a succession of puppets on the throne before finally elevating her own son. The Vatican was no longer a spiritual center. It was the family business, a nest of vipers where incest was common and murder was a sacrament. The promise of eternal life was sold to the highest bidder, while the popes themselves indulged in every sin imaginable, confident that they alone had the power to forgive. The absolute nadir of this period was the reign of Pope John XII, Marozia's grandson. He was made pope at the age of 18, a debauched teenager, given absolute power over the spiritual lives of millions. The papal residence, the Lateran Palace, was turned into a brothel. Witnesses testified that he toasted to the devil during drunken orgies, that he gambled with church offerings, and that he invoked the names of pagan gods like Jupiter and Venus while rolling dice. His sins were not just personal failings, they were a public spectacle of contempt for the office he held. He was accused of mutilating and murdering his opponents, of ordaining a bishop in a stable, and of turning the basilica itself into a hunting lodge. It was said he committed incest with his own sisters and raped female pilgrims who had traveled to Rome seeking salvation. When confronted with his crimes by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I, John's response was to excommunicate anyone who tried to depose him. His end was fittingly sordid. He was not struck down by divine lightning, but was, according to the chroniclers, killed by a jealous husband who discovered the Pope in bed with his wife. He died not in prayer, but in the act of adultery. What does it mean for the concept of apostolic succession, the unbroken line of divine authority stretching back to Christ himself, when that line runs through murderers, adulterers, and rapists? This is a question the Church has never been able to satisfactorily answer. The official explanation is that the unworthiness of the man does not invalidate the sanctity of the office, but could you truly believe you were receiving God's grace from the hands of a man who had just toasted Satan? The era of the pornocracy reveals a terrifying truth about the nature of institutions. It shows that the robes of office, no matter how sacred, are just cloth. The power they signify can be worn by a saint or a monster, and the institution will, above all, protect itself. The real magic trick was not turning bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. It was convincing the world that the debauchery in Rome had no bearing on the legitimacy of the faith itself. The institution had become a perfect parasite, able to thrive regardless of the moral health of its host. This period of internal rot could not last forever. The sheer, unadulterated chaos in Rome was becoming a liability. It weakened the papacy's authority abroad and invited intervention from secular kings who were tired of seeing Christendom's spiritual center run like a gangster's fiefdom. Reform was needed, not necessarily for the good of men's souls, but for the good of the business. The Church needed to clean house to present a more respectable face to the world, if it was to continue its project of global expansion. The memory of the cadaver synod and the boy pope who died in another man's bed had to be buried under a new narrative, one of strength, piety, and purpose. The institution, with its uncanny instinct for survival, was about to pivot. It would channel the violent energies that had torn Rome apart for a century outward toward a common enemy. It would find a way to unite the warring factions of Europe under a single banner to launder its reputation in a river of foreign blood. The age of petty local corruption was ending. The age of grand, holy larceny was about to begin. The call would soon go out from a reformed, revitalized papacy. The call for a crusade. The internal decay of the papacy had become a strategic vulnerability. A church that could not govern its own clergy, let alone its supreme leader, could hardly claim dominion over the kings and kingdoms of the earth. The chaos of the Dark Ages had to be replaced by order, and the solution was a stroke of political and military genius, the Crusades. On the surface, it was a holy mission, a call to arms to reclaim the sacred lands of Jerusalem from Muslim rule. It was framed as the ultimate act of Christian piety, a pilgrimage with swords. But beneath the veneer of religious fervor lay a much colder, more calculated set of objectives. The Crusades were, in essence, the perfect solution to a host of the Church's problems. They were a brilliant scheme to export Europe's excess violence, a massive jobs program for a generation of restless, land-hungry knights who spent most of their time fighting each other. It was a chance to bring the independent Eastern Orthodox Church back under Roman control. And most importantly, it was an opportunity for plunder on an unimaginable scale. Religion was simply the best marketing campaign ever devised for an armed robbery. For 2 centuries, waves of European knights, peasants, and adventurers marched east, fueled by promises of salvation and the prospect of riches. While some were undoubtedly driven by genuine faith, the enterprise was, for its organizers in Rome and Venice, a business. The Fourth Crusade stands as the most cynical and revealing example. This holy army, originally intended to fight in Egypt, was diverted by its Venetian paymasters, who had their eyes on a juicier prize. In the year 1204, the crusading army arrived not at the gates of a Muslim city, but at the walls of Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire. A Christian city. For 3 days, the soldiers of Christ engaged in an orgy of looting, rape, and destruction. They stripped ancient churches of their gold, melted down priceless statues for coin, and desecrated the holiest altars of their Orthodox brethren. It was one of the greatest cultural crimes in history, a brutal sacking that had nothing to do with religious ideals and everything to do with greed and political power. The Pope at the time, Innocent III, publicly condemned the attack, but he quietly accepted the stolen relics and treasures that flowed back to Rome, solidifying his authority. The path to heaven, it turned out, was paved with the gold of the damned. Out of the chaos and opportunity of the Crusades, a new kind of power emerged, the Knights Templar. Founded in the early 12th century as a humble monastic order to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon grew at an astonishing rate. They were warrior monks, a potent combination of piety and military prowess that captured the imagination of Europe. Donations poured in. Kings and nobles granted them vast tracts of land. They became a law unto themselves, answering only to the Pope. But their true genius was not on the battlefield. It was in finance. The Templars invented international banking. A nobleman heading to Jerusalem could deposit his wealth at the Templar Preceptory in London and receive a coded letter of credit, which he could then cash at the Templar headquarters in Jerusalem. It was safe, efficient, and revolutionary. They became the bankers to popes and kings, the treasurers of Europe. Their wealth became legendary, their power immense. They were the world's first multinational corporation, an entity that transcended borders and allegiances, protected by the papal seal. And that was their fatal mistake. They became too rich, too powerful, too independent. They had created a state within a state, a financial empire that owed nothing to any king. King Philip IV of France, a man deeply in debt to the Templar order, saw a solution to his financial woes and a chance to eliminate a powerful rival. He needed the Pope's blessing to move against them. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was a Frenchman, a virtual prisoner of the king. On Friday, October 13, 1307, a date that has haunted popular superstition ever since, Philip's men launched a coordinated dawn raid across France, arresting every Templar they could find. The charges were sensational and absurd: heresy, idolatry, spitting on the cross, institutionalized sodomy. The Templars were handed over to the Inquisition, where they were systematically and brutally tortured. Confessions were extracted under unimaginable pain. Knights confessed to worshipping a demonic head named Baphomet, to desecrating the crucifix, to whatever their tormentors wanted to hear. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was slow roasted over a fire in Paris, proclaiming his innocence to the end. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not a matter of justice or faith. It was the first great hostile takeover in history, a corporate raid orchestrated by a king and sanctioned by a pope. King Philip seized the Templars' vast assets in France, solving his debt problem overnight. Pope Clement officially disbanded the order and transferred much of its remaining property to a rival order, the Knights Hospitaller, who were conveniently forced to pay the papacy a massive processing fee. The Church and the state colluded to destroy the world's most powerful financial institution, murdering its leaders and seizing its wealth under the color of law and the pretext of heresy. It was a chilling demonstration of the Vatican's ultimate power, the power not just to bless, but to curse, not just to create, but to utterly destroy. The fires that consumed the last Templar Knights were a message to the rest of the world. There can be only one true power, one ultimate authority. All other corporations, all other kingdoms exist only at its pleasure. The immense wealth that flowed into the papal coffers from this venture would fuel a new era of splendor and artistic patronage, but also a new level of corruption that would make the pornocracy look tame. It would fund the ambitions of a single family whose name would become synonymous with papal crime, Borgia. The wealth plundered from the Crusades and seized from the Templars flowed back to Rome, transforming the city. The Vatican became a beacon of the Renaissance, a patron of geniuses like Michelangelo and Raphael. But this explosion of art and culture was financed by a system of corruption so pervasive it would have been unrecognizable to the first apostles. The sale of indulgences, certificates that promised to reduce time in purgatory, became a primary source of income. It was, quite simply, selling salvation. And no family mastered the art of leveraging wealth and spiritual power for personal gain better than the Borgias. They were outsiders from Spain who arrived in Rome and saw the papacy not as a holy office, but as the ultimate prize in a game of power. When Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia began his campaign for the papacy in the late 15th century, he did so not with prayers, but with 4 mule loads of silver sent to a key rival to secure his vote. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, and the Vatican officially became the headquarters of a criminal syndicate. The reign of Alexander VI was scandalous, even by the debased standards of the time. The papal court was a whirlwind of lavish parties that often descended into orgies. But behind the feasting and festivities was a cold, calculating political machine run by the Pope and his ambitious children. The most formidable of these was his son Cesare Borgia, a brilliant and utterly ruthless military commander whom his father made a cardinal at the age of 18. Cesare quickly tired of the cloth, cast off his cardinal's robes, the first person in history to do so, and set about carving out a hereditary kingdom for the Borgia family in the heart of the Papal States. His methods were direct and effective, a combination of warfare, treachery, and assassination. Rival lords and rebellious cardinals who stood in his way were invited to dinner only to be garroted by Cesare's men before dessert. He was the man who inspired Niccolò Machiavelli's infamous treatise on power, The Prince. Machiavelli saw in Cesare the perfect ruler, a man unbound by morality, who understood that fear is a more reliable tool of governance than love. The father, Pope Alexander, used his spiritual authority to bless his son's conquests, annul inconvenient marriages, and excommunicate his enemies, paving the way for Cesare's army. It was the perfect fusion of church and state, sword and cross, all in service of one family's ambition. Then there was Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter, a woman who has been painted by history as a femme fatale, a poisoner, and a master of intrigue. The truth is more complex, but she was undoubtedly a pawn in her family's dynastic games. Her marriages were political tools. She was married off to powerful men to secure alliances, and when those alliances were no longer useful, her husbands had a tendency to die suddenly. Her first marriage was annulled on the humiliating and likely false grounds of her husband's impotence. Her second husband was brutally murdered on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica by assassins widely believed to be working for her brother, Cesare. Rumors of incest swirled around the family, whispers that both her father and her brother were her lovers. While likely exaggerated by their enemies, these rumors speak to the atmosphere of absolute moral decay that surrounded the Borgia papacy. In the Vatican of the Borgias, nothing was sacred. Everything, sacraments, offices, marriages, and lives, was for sale. What is more terrifying, a sinner who is aware of his fall, or a saint convinced of his own infallibility? The Borgias' preferred tool for dealing with wealthy cardinals and political opponents was a poison of their own invention, a white powder of unknown composition known as cantarella. It was said to be tasteless and slow-acting, a sophisticated weapon for a sophisticated court. When the Pope needed to raise money or seize a fortune, a wealthy cardinal would be invited to a private dinner. A toast would be made, a glass of wine would be drunk, and a few days later the cardinal would be dead. His property, by church law, would then revert to the papal treasury. It was a brutally efficient form of wealth redistribution. The Borgias perfected the art of the political assassination, turning the papal court into a place of mortal terror. They demonstrated that the power to forgive sins was also the power to commit them without consequence. For a decade, they reigned supreme, a holy family that behaved like a crime family, using the machinery of the church to wage a private war of conquest and enrichment. Their audacity was breathtaking. They were not hiding their sins, they were flaunting them, secure in the knowledge that the man who held the keys of St. Peter could never be judged by any earthly authority. Their empire, however, was built on the life of one man. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, ironically, some historians believe, from accidentally poisoning himself at a dinner meant for another, the family's power structure collapsed overnight. Cesare, ill at the same time, was unable to control the papal election, and a bitter rival of the Borgias was elected pope. Cesare was arrested and exiled, his hard-won kingdom crumbling to dust. He was killed in a minor skirmish in Spain a few years later, a sad end for the man who was once the master of Italy. The Borgia era was a brief but spectacular explosion of greed and violence that exposed the papacy for what it had become: an Italian monarchy, a worldly institution obsessed with money and power. They stripped away the last pretense of spirituality, but their methods of silencing dissent and eliminating rivals were just a dress rehearsal. The physical poisons of the Borgias were crude compared to the ideological poison the Church was about to unleash upon the world, in its war not against rival families, but against knowledge itself. Do you think a leader should be guided by moral principles or by pragmatic results? Let us know in the comments which path you would choose if you held absolute power. The brutality of the Borgias was the brutality of gangsters, focused on tangible goals, wealth, land, and power for their family. It was a worldly evil easily understood. But as the Renaissance blossomed into the Age of Enlightenment, the Vatican faced a new and far more dangerous enemy. The enemy was not a rival army or a political conspiracy. It was an idea. The idea that humanity could understand the universe through reason, observation, and science without the mediation of a priest. This was a threat far greater than any king or emperor, for it struck at the very root of the Church's authority. If people could find truth on their own, why would they need the Vatican? The response was a declaration of war on the human mind itself, a war waged by a shadowy and terrifying organization, the Holy Roman and Universal Inquisition. The Inquisition was not a new invention, but under the pressure of the Scientific Revolution and the Protestant Reformation, it was refined into a ruthlessly efficient machine of intellectual repression. Its purpose was simple: to hunt down and eliminate heresy in all its forms. But the definition of heresy expanded to include not just theological dissent, but any thought that challenged the Church's worldview. Science became the new enemy. The case of Giordano Bruno is a chilling example. Bruno was not just an astronomer, he was a philosopher, a visionary who postulated that the stars were distant suns, each with its own planets, and that the universe was infinite. This was not just a scientific theory, it was a spiritual vision that shattered the cozy, human-centered cosmos of the Church. For this crime of imagination, Bruno was hunted across Europe for years by the Inquisition. He was finally captured, imprisoned for 7 years in Rome, and subjected to relentless interrogation. He refused to recant his ideas. In the year 1600, he was declared a heretic, taken to the Campo dei Fiori, the Field of Flowers, and burned alive at the stake. His execution was a public spectacle, a message from the Church to the thinkers of the world. This is the fate of those who dare to think for themselves. The trial of Galileo Galilei, a few decades later, was a more subtle but equally sinister affair. Galileo, using his newly invented telescope, had gathered overwhelming evidence for the Copernican theory that the Earth revolves around the Sun. This directly contradicted the scripture-based doctrine that the Earth was the fixed center of the universe. The Church could not tolerate it. Unlike Bruno, Galileo was a celebrated scientist, a friend of cardinals and princes. A public burning was not an option, so the Inquisition used psychological warfare. The aging Galileo was shown the instruments of torture and threatened with their use. Broken and afraid, he knelt before the cardinals of the Inquisition and publicly renounced his life's work. He was forced to declare that the Earth did not move. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, a broken man. The Church had won. It had silenced the greatest mind of the age, proving that even empirical, observable truth was no match for dogma backed by the threat of violence. The inquisitors burned witches at the stake, but the real magic was happening in their dungeons, where they could make a man deny the evidence of his own eyes. The war on reason was not just fought against famous scientists, it was a war on the common people, particularly on women. The infamous witch hunts that swept across Europe for 3 centuries were fueled and legitimized by a single book, commissioned and endorsed by the Church, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This book was a detailed manual for identifying, prosecuting, and torturing women accused of witchcraft. It was a work of pure misogynistic paranoia, filled with lurid descriptions of satanic pacts and sexual congress with demons. It created a legal and theological framework for mass murder. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were tortured and killed based on the evidence prescribed in this book. A witch's mark, which could be any mole or birthmark, a confession extracted under duress, or the testimony of a spiteful neighbor. The Malleus Maleficarum turned folk superstition into a state-sponsored killing machine. It was a tool to enforce social control, to eliminate independent women, midwives, and healers, and to create a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Could you keep a secret that could destroy the faith of millions but save the world from chaos? The Inquisition was the world's first truly modern totalitarian bureaucracy. It had its own police, its own spies, its own courts, and its own executioners. It operated outside of secular law, a state within a state. The process was designed to terrify and crush the individual. An accusation, often made anonymously, was enough to land you in an inquisitorial prison. You were not told the names of your accusers or the specific charges against you. You were considered guilty until proven innocent, an impossible task. The goal of the interrogation was not to discover the truth, but to extract a confession. And the methods for extracting that confession were legendary in their cruelty. The rack, the strappado, the water cure, a whole technology of pain was developed and refined in the service of God. The public execution, the auto da fe, or act of faith, was the final stage, a piece of religious theatre where the condemned were paraded through the streets and then burned alive for the edification of the faithful. It was a system that perfected the art of breaking the human spirit, a dark testament to the lengths the institution would go to protect its monopoly on truth. This long, brutal war against free thought left deep scars on Western civilization. It drove science into secrecy, fostered a culture of hypocrisy, and equated intellectual curiosity with sin. Entire communities, like the Cathars of southern France, were exterminated in bloody crusades justified by accusations of heresy. The Church successfully slowed the march of scientific progress, but it could not stop it. The ideas it tried to suppress eventually triumphed, but at a terrible human cost. The fires of the Inquisition eventually died down, not because the Church had a change of heart, but because its methods were becoming obsolete. A new form of power was emerging, one that was more subtle and in many ways more potent than the fear of the stake. While the Church was publicly policing the boundaries of human thought, it was privately mastering a much more modern and worldly discipline. It was learning the art of finance. The transition was seamless. The institution that had once burned heretics for profit would soon be laundering money for gangsters. In the 20th century, the Vatican's methods of control evolved. The fires of the Inquisition were extinguished, but a new, more discreet power was being cultivated within the ancient walls: the power of money. In 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Pope Pius XII founded a unique financial institution. It was officially called the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. The world would come to know it simply as the Vatican Bank. Its stated purpose was noble: to manage funds designated for religious and charitable works. Its true function was far murkier. It was created as a bank that operated outside of all national and international regulations. It was an offshore haven in the heart of Rome, accountable to no one but the Pope. It had no public oversight, published no accounts, and was shrouded in a veil of absolute secrecy. It was the perfect tool for moving money quietly, for purposes both sacred and profoundly profane. For decades, the Vatican Bank operated in the shadows, a financial black hole at the center of the Catholic world. The bank's darkest secrets began to spill into public view in the 1970s, with the rise of two men who would become known as God's bankers. The first was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian financier with deep ties to the Gambino crime family in New York and the ruling Christian Democracy Party in Italy. Sindona was a financial wizard, a master of shell companies and fraudulent accounting. He was also a trusted agent of the Vatican. He managed a significant portion of the Holy See's foreign investments and used his connection to the Vatican Bank to launder vast sums of money for the Sicilian mafia, the Cosa Nostra. Heroin money from the infamous Pizza Connection drug smuggling ring was washed clean through the accounts of the Institute for the Works of Religion, transformed from dirty drug profits into pristine, untraceable Vatican assets. The bank provided the ultimate service. It could make sin in the form of cash disappear. It was a spiritual and financial laundry service, all under the benevolent gaze of the Pope. Sindona's partner in this unholy alliance was Roberto Calvi, the head of Italy's largest private bank, Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi was known as the man with the poison eyes, a secretive and ambitious banker who built a financial empire on a mountain of debt and deception. A key shareholder in his bank was the Vatican Bank itself. Together, Calvi and Sindona, with the help of the Vatican Bank's American-born president, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, created a labyrinthine network of offshore shell companies. They used this network to illegally export billions of dollars out of Italy, to manipulate stock prices, and to fund covert political activities. Archbishop Marcinkus, a tough-talking former bodyguard from Cicero, Illinois, famously quipped, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." Under his leadership, the Vatican Bank became deeply entangled not only with the mafia, but also with Propaganda Due, or P2, a secret quasi-Masonic lodge of right-wing politicians, spies, and military officers who were plotting to overthrow the Italian government. The Vatican Bank was no longer just laundering money for criminals, it was helping to finance a shadow state. The House of Cards came crashing down in the early 1980s. Michele Sindona's financial empire collapsed, and he was convicted in the United States of America for his role in the failure of the Franklin National Bank. He was extradited to Italy to face murder charges, and in 1986 he was found dead in his maximum security prison cell, poisoned by a cup of cyanide-laced coffee. He had threatened to reveal everything he knew about the Vatican's financial dealings. Someone made sure he never would. Just before his death, he told an interviewer, "They are afraid that I will name names. the money laundering of the mafia. I am a danger for a lot of people in high places. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but few believed it. It was a message sent from the shadowy world where high finance and organized crime meet, the same world that would claim his partner, Roberto Calvi. In 1982, Banco Ambrosiano collapsed under the weight of $1.3 billion in fraudulent loans made to shell companies controlled by the Vatican Bank. Roberto Calvi fled Italy on a false passport. A few days later, on the morning of June 18th, his body was discovered hanging from scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London. His pockets were filled with bricks and $15,000 in cash. The scene was bizarre, steeped in Masonic symbolism. Blackfriars, a reference to the P2 Lodge's nickname for themselves. British authorities initially ruled his death a suicide, a verdict that was met with widespread disbelief. His family fought for years to prove he was murdered. Decades later, Italian prosecutors agreed, concluding that Calvi had been suicided by the mafia because he was unable to pay back the money they had lost in his bank's collapse. They believe he was murdered as a warning to others who might mishandle the Cosa Nostra's funds. Archbishop Marcinkus, protected by Vatican sovereignty, was indicted by Italian authorities but never stood trial. He simply retreated behind the Vatican walls where Italian law could not reach him and eventually retired to Sun City, Arizona. The Vatican denied any wrongdoing in the affair, but it eventually paid out $250 million to the creditors of Banco Ambrosiano as a goodwill gesture. It was a tacit admission of its moral, if not legal, involvement. The scandal of God's bankers was a brutal exposé of the Vatican's transformation into a modern financial power. It showed an institution willing to partner with organized crime, to launder drug money, and to associate with shadowy anti-democratic forces in order to protect and grow its wealth. The greed and corruption were so deeply embedded in the system that anyone who threatened to expose it was putting their life in mortal danger. This was true for bankers and journalists, and it may even have been true for a pope. The intricate web of financial crime woven by Marcinkus, Calvi, and Sindona was the very thing that a newly elected pope, a man with a reputation for humility and integrity, was rumored to be investigating just before his sudden, inexplicable death. In August of 1978, after the death of Pope Paul VI, the cardinals of the Catholic Church elected a man who was, in many ways, the antithesis of the Vatican power structure. Albino Luciani was a humble man, the son of a bricklayer, with a warm smile and a deep pastoral concern for the poor. He took the name John Paul I. He was immediately beloved by the public, who nicknamed him the Smiling Pope. He seemed poised to bring a new era of openness and simplicity to a church plagued by accusations of arrogance and corruption. But from the moment of his election, he was a man at odds with the powerful, entrenched bureaucracy of the Roman Curia. He was an outsider, an idealist in a nest of cynics and power brokers. He was particularly disturbed by the rumors swirling around the Vatican Bank and its controversial president, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. One of his first acts as Pope was to begin an investigation into the bank's murky finances. He did not know that he was signing his own death warrant. Pope John Paul I had ambitious plans. He wanted to reform the Curia, to bring the Church closer to the people, and, most dangerously, to clean up the Institute for the Works of Religion. He had conversations with cardinals and journalists about his intentions. He requested files related to the bank's investments and its connections to Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi. According to researchers who have investigated his death, he was preparing a massive shakeup. He had compiled a list of over 100 high-ranking officials, bishops, cardinals, and financiers, whom he intended to dismiss or reassign. This list reportedly included Archbishop Marcinkus himself, as well as many other figures connected to the P2 Masonic Lodge and the financial underworld. This move would have been a revolution, a direct assault on the corrupt power structure that had controlled the Vatican's finances for decades. It would have exposed the institution to massive scandal and financial loss. The men on that list had everything to lose: their power, their wealth, and their freedom. He was planning to make his announcement within days. He never got the chance. On the morning of September 29, 1978, just 33 days after his election, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his bed. He was 65 years old and believed to be in good health. The official Vatican story was that he had died of a heart attack while reading religious texts. But from the very beginning, the story was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. The Vatican initially claimed he was discovered by his male secretaries, only to later admit it was a nun, Sister Vincenza, who found the body, a fact they likely concealed to avoid the unseemly detail of a woman being in the Pope's private chambers in the early morning. They claimed he had complained of chest pains the day before, but his personal doctor denied this, stating the Pope had been in excellent condition during a checkup just a week earlier. Most suspiciously, the Pope's last will and testament, his personal glasses and the notes he was reportedly working on, the night of his death all disappeared from his room. They have never been seen again. The most damning fact, the one that fueled conspiracy theories for decades, was the Vatican's absolute refusal to perform an autopsy. Under Italian law, an autopsy is required for any sudden, unexpected death. But the Vatican, as a sovereign state, is not bound by Italian law. Citing an obscure, long obsolete tradition that popes are not to be autopsied, the Holy See rejected all requests for a formal examination of the body. Within 24 hours before the official cause of death was even determined, the Pope's body was hastily embalmed, a procedure that would make it impossible to detect most poisons. Why the rush? What were they so afraid of finding? The decision not to perform an autopsy is, for many, the single greatest piece of evidence that there was something to hide. It was a textbook case of destroying the evidence of a crime. For an institution obsessed with ritual and tradition, this hurried, almost panicked handling of the papal body was a shocking break from protocol. The theory that Pope John Paul I was murdered is not the stuff of fringe fiction. It is a serious hypothesis advanced by credible investigators and journalists, most notably David Yallop in his meticulously researched book, In God's Name. The argument is compelling. The Pope had a clear motive to be killed. His planned reform of the Vatican Bank threatened a criminal enterprise worth billions. A number of powerful individuals had the means and opportunity to carry out the murder. The weapon would have been simple and untraceable. A dose of digitalis, a heart medication that in large doses induces a fatal heart attack, leaving almost no trace in the body, especially after embalming. The subsequent actions of the Vatican, the conflicting stories, the missing documents, the refusal of an autopsy, are all consistent with a cover-up. Did a group of high-ranking prelates, in collusion with mobsters and shadow politicians, conspire to murder the Vicar of Christ to protect their financial empire? The evidence is circumstantial, but the mountain of suspicion is enormous. The 33-day papacy of the smiling Pope remains one of the Vatican's darkest and most unsettling mysteries. It suggests that the institution, when threatened, will resort to the ultimate sin to preserve its worldly power. A pope is dead. The official cause, a heart attack. The suspicious circumstances, no autopsy, missing papers, and powerful enemies. Was it natural causes or a perfect murder? Tell us what you believe happened to the smiling Pope in the comments below. The potential murder of a pope to protect a web of financial corruption is a horrifying thought. It reveals a chilling calculus at the heart of the institution that the secrets of the bank were more sacred than the life of the pontiff. But as the 20th century drew to a close, a new and even more monstrous secret began to surface. This was not a crime of money and power in the abstract. It was a crime against the human body and the human soul, a sin committed not against cardinals and bankers, but against the most vulnerable and innocent members of the flock, children. For decades, a silent epidemic had been raging within the Catholic Church, a plague of child sexual abuse perpetrated by priests. And even more damning than the abuse itself was the systematic, global conspiracy orchestrated from the very highest levels of the Vatican to cover it up. This was not the failure of a few bad men, it was the calculated policy of an institution more concerned with its own reputation than with the lives of the children it was supposed to protect. The dam of silence finally broke in 2002 with a groundbreaking investigation by the Spotlight team at the Boston Globe newspaper. The reporters uncovered a pattern of abuse in the Boston Archdiocese that stretched back for decades. They found that Cardinal Bernard Law, the Archbishop of Boston, had been aware of credible accusations against dozens of priests in his charge. But instead of turning them over to the police, instead of removing them from ministry, he and his officials did something far more sinister. They quietly transferred the abusive priests from one parish to another. A priest accused of molesting children in one town would simply be moved to a new town where he was given a fresh start and a fresh supply of unsuspecting children. It was a game of clerical shell game played with the lives of kids. The investigation revealed that this was not just incompetence, it was policy. The primary objective was always to avoid scandal, to protect the good name of the church. The protection of children was a distant, secondary concern. The Boston scandal was just the tip of the iceberg. As journalists and investigators in other countries began to dig, the same horrific pattern emerged everywhere. In Ireland, a series of government reports revealed decades of sadistic, physical, and sexual abuse in church-run industrial schools and orphanages. Children were beaten, starved, and systematically raped by the priests and nuns who were supposed to be their guardians. In some institutions, known as baby factories, unmarried mothers were forced to give up their children for adoption, while a shocking number of infants died from neglect and were buried in unmarked mass graves. In Australia, a royal commission uncovered thousands of cases of abuse and a similar culture of cover-up. In Germany, the Pope's own brother was implicated in a scandal involving the physical abuse of boys in a prestigious cathedral choir. From the United States of America to Mexico, from Poland to the Philippines, the story was the same. A global network of abuse facilitated by a global institution that prioritized its own secrets over justice for the victims. The cover-up was not improvised. It was directed by official Vatican policy. For decades, a secret internal document known as Crimen Solicitationis governed how the Church handled accusations of sexual abuse. This document, issued by the Holy Office, the modern successor to the Inquisition, instructed bishops not to report accusations of abuse to the civil authorities. Instead, they were to be handled internally under the strictest secrecy, with both the accuser and the priest bound by an oath of silence enforced by the threat of excommunication. The goal was to keep the crime in the family, to prevent public scandal at all costs. This policy effectively made the Church an accessory after the fact in tens of thousands of crimes. It created a shadow legal system, one that protected predators and silenced their victims. It was a conspiracy of silence codified in canon law and enforced from Rome. This wasn't just about a few bishops making bad decisions, it was a systemic, top-down strategy to obstruct justice. For the victims, the Church's response was a second assault. Children who had the courage to report their abuse were often disbelieved, shamed, or told to pray for their abusers. Their families were intimidated into silence. As adults, when they sought justice, they were met with a wall of denial and legal stonewalling. The Church spent hundreds of millions of dollars not on therapy for victims, but on high-priced lawyers to fight their claims in court, often using bankruptcy laws to shield its assets. The institution that preached forgiveness and reconciliation showed a face of cold, corporate indifference to those it had so grievously harmed. The pain of the abuse was compounded by the pain of this profound betrayal. The very institution that promised them God's love had protected the men who had stolen their innocence. The great cover-up of clerical sex abuse is arguably the most unforgivable of the Vatican sins. It is a crime that continues to unfold, with new revelations still emerging. It represents a moral collapse on a global scale, a betrayal of the most fundamental trust placed in any human institution. It exposed the cynical heart of the modern Vatican, an organization so obsessed with its own power and image that it was willing to sacrifice countless children on the altar of its reputation. The men who orchestrated this cover-up were not monsters in the mold of Cesare Borgia. They were bureaucrats, lawyers, and administrators. Their evil was the mundane evil of the committee room, the carefully worded memo that placed institutional survival above human decency. This conspiracy of silence relied on an absolute control of information, a grip that had served the Church for centuries. But in the 21st century, the age of the internet and the whistleblower, secrets were becoming much harder to keep. The ancient walls of the Vatican were about to be breached, not by an invading army, but by a simple data leak. The culture of secrecy that enabled the global abuse cover-up was not just a defensive measure, it was the native atmosphere of the Vatican. For centuries, power within the Curia was built on privileged information, on knowing things that others did not. But the digital age presented a new kind of threat. Information could now be copied and disseminated with the click of a button, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers. In 2012, the Vatican's ancient defenses were breached from the inside, not by a foreign spy, but by the Pope's own butler. The scandal, which became known as VatiLeaks, was a quintessentially modern crisis for a medieval institution. It revealed that the palace intrigues of the Borgia era had not vanished. They had simply migrated to encrypted emails and password-protected files. It was a tale of espionage, blackmail, and a bitter power struggle at the very heart of the Church, a struggle that would ultimately contribute to the almost unprecedented resignation of a pope. The whistleblower was Paolo Gabriele, the quiet, unassuming personal valet to Pope Benedict XVI. For years he had been a member of the intimate papal household, one of the few people who saw the Pope daily, serving his meals and laying out his clothes. But Gabriele had become disillusioned. He saw a pope who was, in his view, isolated and manipulated by a corrupt curia. He believed the Church was rotting from within. So he began to secretly photocopy sensitive documents that crossed the Pope's desk. Private letters, internal financial reports, coded diplomatic cables. He amassed a vast trove of the Vatican's most confidential papers. He then leaked them to an Italian journalist, Gianluigi Nuzzi, who published them in a blockbuster book titled His Holiness, The Secret Papers of Benedict XVI. The leak was a bombshell. It was the equivalent of the President of the United States of America's Chief of Staff leaking the entire contents of the Oval Office's filing cabinets. The Vatican was thrown into a state of panic and paranoia. A mole hunt was launched. The leaked documents painted a damning picture of the Vatican under Benedict XVI. They revealed fierce infighting between rival factions of cardinals, a careerism and a jealousy that Benedict himself would later decry. They detailed allegations of corruption and cronyism in the awarding of Vatican contracts, with one senior official being transferred after he tried to clean up the system. They exposed new scandals at the Vatican Bank, showing that despite past reforms it was still being used for money laundering and other illicit activities. But the most sensational and damaging revelations concerned the existence of what the Italian press dubbed a powerful gay lobby within the Vatican. A secret report compiled for the Pope by 3 trusted cardinals allegedly described a network of homosexual prelates, some of whom were being blackmailed by outsiders who knew of their activities. This faction was said to wield immense influence, able to make or break careers within the Curia. The leaks suggested a Vatican that was not just corrupt, but deeply compromised and vulnerable to extortion. The hunt for the leaker became an obsession. The Vatican Gendarmerie, the city-state's police force, raided offices and interrogated officials. Eventually their suspicion fell on Paolo Gabriele. He was arrested and held in a Vatican jail cell. His trial was a surreal spectacle, a modern espionage case conducted with the procedures of an antiquated monarchy. Gabriele confessed, but insisted he acted out of love for the Church and the Pope, whom he saw as a lamb surrounded by wolves. He was convicted of aggravated theft and sentenced to 18 months in prison. A few months later, in a carefully stage-managed act of papal mercy, Benedict visited Gabriele in his cell and pardoned him. But the damage was done. The VatiLeaks scandal had shattered the Vatican's aura of mystique and impenetrable secrecy. It exposed the institution as a deeply dysfunctional snake pit of ambition and intrigue, a place where blackmail and whispers held more power than prayer. Just a few months after pardoning his butler, in February 2013, Pope Benedict XVI did something no pope had done in nearly 600 years. He resigned. The official reason given was his advanced age and declining strength. But many Vatican insiders believe that the VatiLeaks scandal and the shocking contents of the secret report on corruption and blackmail were the final straw. Benedict, an intellectual and a theologian, was temperamentally unsuited to the brutal infighting of the Curia. He had looked into the abyss of the institution he was supposed to lead and decided he could not fix it. His resignation was a stunning admission of defeat, a declaration that the problems plaguing the modern Vatican were so entrenched that even the Pope himself was powerless to solve them. The butler had, in his own way, won. He had exposed the rot, and the exposure had toppled a pontiff. The scandal proved that in the 21st century, the greatest threat to an organization built on secrets is not an army, but a flash drive. But the documents Gabriele leaked were just the tip of the iceberg, a tiny fraction of the secrets held in the Vatican's ultimate repository of knowledge, a place far more secure than any papal apartment, the secret archives. The leaks by Paolo Gabriele were a glimpse through the keyhole. They revealed the petty corruption and power struggles of the present day, but what of the past? What secrets lie buried deeper in the 85 kilometers of shelving that constitute one of the most inaccessible and mysterious places on Earth, the Vatican's secret archives? The name itself is a misnomer, born of a poor translation. The Latin archivum secretum is better translated as the private archive, but secret has stuck, and for good reason. For centuries, these archives, containing the state papers, correspondence, and papal account books for more than 1,000 years of history, have fueled endless speculation. What truths and what lies are guarded within its climate-controlled vaults? What historical time bombs lie waiting in the pages of its ancient manuscripts? The archives are the Vatican's institutional memory, the hard drive of its long and often bloody history. And there are some files that many believe the Church will never allow to see the light of day. Perhaps the most contentious and explosive secret still guarded by the archives concerns the actions, or inaction, of Pope Pius XII during the Second World War and the Holocaust. For decades, a bitter debate has raged. Was he, as his defenders claim, a quiet diplomat who worked behind the scenes to save hundreds of thousands of Jews? Or was he, as his critics have dubbed him, Hitler's Pope, a man whose public silence in the face of genocide amounted to a moral complicity, a silence motivated by a fear of Nazism, but also a deep-seated institutional anti-Semitism? The Vatican has long maintained that Pius did all he could, and that a public condemnation of Hitler would have only resulted in a brutal backlash against Catholics and the Jews he was secretly protecting. Critics argue his primary concern was protecting the Church's institutional power and its property in Germany. They point to his failure to speak out even when the Jews of Rome itself were rounded up by the SS in 1943, literally under the windows of the Vatican. The truth, in all its damning or exonerating detail, lies in the documents from his papacy. Only in recent years has the Vatican begun to open these specific archives to scholars, and the picture that is emerging is complex, murky, and for many, deeply unflattering to the Holy See. But the secrets may be far stranger than the grim politics of the 20th century. The archives are a treasure trove for conspiracy theories. There are persistent rumors of documents suppressed by the Church because they would fundamentally undermine the faith itself. Are there letters that cast doubt on the historical existence of Jesus Christ? Are there records of early church councils where doctrines were decided not by divine inspiration, but by a political vote, where the divinity of Christ was carried by a slim margin? What about the legendary Third Secret of Fatima, a prophecy given to 3 Portuguese children in 1917? The Vatican released what it claimed was the full text in the year 2000, interpreting it as a vision of the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But many Fatimists believe the true secret, a far more apocalyptic prophecy about a great apostasy beginning at the very top of the Church, has been suppressed. And then there are the wilder theories that the archives contain evidence of contact with extraterrestrial life or even the mortal remains of alien beings. While seemingly absurd, such stories speak to a deeper truth. The archives represent the unknown, the ultimate repository of secrets that we sense could change the world if revealed. The greatest secret of the Vatican, however, may not be a specific document or a hidden fact. It is the institution's uncanny ability to survive. For 2,000 years, it has weathered schisms, reformations, wars, and scandals that would have destroyed any other kingdom or corporation. It has survived popes who were murderers and popes who were saints. It has preached chastity while its priests fathered children. It has preached poverty while accumulating unimaginable wealth. It has preached truth while building an empire on forgery. This resilience is its true dark magic. The institution endures because it has mastered the art of narrative control. It understands that power comes not from being sinless, but from being the sole authority that defines what sin is, and more importantly, who has the power to forgive it. The archives are the ultimate instrument of this power. They contain the raw data of history, which the Vatican can choose to release, interpret, or conceal to shape its own story. The power to control the past is the power to control the future. Today, under Pope Francis, the Church is once again engaged in a campaign of reform. He speaks of a poor church for the poor. He has taken on financial corruption, and he has apologized for the horrors of clerical abuse. But is this a genuine revolution, a fundamental change in the DNA of the institution? Or is it another masterful pivot, another strategic adaptation to a changing world? Is it a true reckoning with its past sins, or simply a more sophisticated form of public relations? The history written in its secret archives suggests caution. It tells a story of an institution that does not truly change, but merely changes its tactics. The fundamental goal, the preservation and expansion of its own power, remains constant. The ultimate sin of the Vatican is not any single act of murder, greed, or lust. It is the profound and arrogant belief that it is an entity above humanity, exempt from the moral laws it imposes on the rest of us. It is an institution that has, time and time again, confused itself with God. The Vatican has hidden its secrets for 2 millennia, but in the end, we all must choose what we believe. After hearing this story, what is the Vatican's greatest secret in your eyes? Its immense wealth or its power to manipulate history? Share your final verdict in the comments. The truth, as they say, will set you free. But first, it might make you very angry.